Hi, how's it going, everybody? And welcome to the Debutify podcast, the premier e-commerce podcast brought to you by Debutify. I'm your host, Alex Bond, and joining me today is Jim Kennemer, the founder and managing director of Cosmo Sourcing, a full-service general sourcing company with branches in China, Vietnam, and the United States. On this episode, Jim and I discuss the viability of Vietnam as a sourcing location, his experience creating a globalized workforce, the value of being adaptable, and much more. Here's our interview now. Jim, welcome to the show.
That's great to be here.
Yeah, very happy to have you. So first off, why don't you tell me a little bit about your company, Cosmo Sourcing?
Oh, yeah. So Cosmo Sourcing is a full service sourcing company. We have teams based in Shanghai and Ho Chi Minh City, as well as Madison, Wisconsin, which is where I live. Yeah, we started Cosmo Sourcing in 2012, originally Shanghai, focused on China sourcing. 2014, I decided to actually move to Vietnam and start sourcing from Vietnam as well. I was one of the first sourcing companies in Vietnam. I think I'm the second or third oldest sourcing company. Yeah, I've been sourcing largely from both countries since 2014. And then, yeah, we help clients of all sizes.
And I think that story is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I did a little research on you, and I think that ability to, essentially plan to source outdoor gear, right? In Shanghai in 2012.
Yeah.
And then just 2 years later, deciding to relocate to Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam and end up broadening your scope and the business model a little bit. I'm curious what made you make that pivot so rapidly?
Yeah. So I think with outdoor gear, like I started Hartford Outdoor Sports Supply. I did a hike part of the Appalachian Trail. My Appalachian Trail name was Haas. So I kind of ran with that, HOSS. And I used to also be a water rafting guide, so I had connections in the industry already. So I think it's just kind of a natural place for me to start. I knew people who would buy supplies. And so I started just sourcing those just because I was in China. I was living in China at the time, working an unrelated job. Actually, I was a project manager for a tech company. So I did this on the side and just started sourcing the outdoor gear. So I did rafts, I did kayaks, I did paddles, I did helmets, life jackets, PDF gear, a bunch of other stuff originally. After a while, just kind of separately and together, kind of more or less, just people knew I was in China and they were, looking at factories. So they started asking me on the side, to visit factories for them, maybe verify some factories, find factories for various suppliers. So I started doing that on the side. And this is 2012 when I was working that. In 2013-ish, I actually decided to quit my job and kind of focus on sourcing full time. Yeah, also in 2013, I visited Vietnam on vacation, just loved the country. I was living in China for 2 years, kind of got burned out by it as well. It's kind of frustrating country to live in, if I'm being honest. August 2014, I decided to move to Vietnam, start focusing on Vietnam sourcing as well as China. I was still doing a lot of China sourcing. Yeah, just fell in love with the country and started doing that. At the time, Trans-Pacific Partnership was in talking. It was pretty late stages, about to be approved. It did not get approved for the record, but it would at a time been the largest free trade agreement in the world. 14 countries that all border the Pacific Rim, including Vietnam, would have been signed it. Yeah, even then, even though it didn't pass or got repealed, I still had plenty of clients reach out to me. So I spent a year and a half living in Vietnam, focusing at that time. And then, started sourcing a lot of wood and industrial goods was kind of my specialty at the time. I did wheelbarrow handles, giant spools for cables, like the huge ones that are like 8 feet wide. But yeah, from there, I've done pretty much everything. I do a lot of clothing, a lot of backpacks, a lot of furniture, stamped metal goods, silicone goods.
It sounds like a little bit of everything, honestly.
Yeah, we're a general sourcing company. So basically, if it can be made in either Vietnam or China, we can source it for you. As long as there's a supplier, we can do it. So we pretty much do everything but perishable goods. So we don't do food items. But other than that, we do, everything.
No, that's awesome. And I think there's something, I kind of want to talk about maybe what you learned in there. But I got to say, I think it's something interesting in kind of like starting with what you know, and then actually, outdoor gear. You had a history and a perspective of like, what do people want and what do people need? So this is what I can provide them. Then because you have insight.
I was a professional water rafting guide, so I knew quality was important. So I knew what good quality looked like and what bad quality looked like.
Exactly.
That to me was what people liked about it. Is I could actually, fill a paddle and know to win a break.
But then I find like people like yourself and entrepreneurs, they kind of start with what they know, and then they end up giving people. They end up coming up with a brand new idea and then providing people with that because they can kind of take that train of thought and just run with it, And I think there's something pretty cool there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to start is what you know. And then for me, I knew two things. I knew at the time, I knew kind of whitewater rafting, the outdoor industry, had connections with that. And I knew China. So it was just combining those two things and bring stuff to the market at the time.
Yeah. And then a little bit of risk and a little bit of adventure.
Yeah. Then as I did that, I got familiar more with sourcing, how to buy products, how to negotiate with factories, how to work with factories, et cetera. And then, yeah, started kind of general sourcing after about a year.
Well, and I'm curious if you think that that's kind of like an important skill that entrepreneurs and business owners should be able to develop, because really it's just being adaptable. I mean, there's a little bit of personal in there of like, I didn't really love living in China, but it also, I felt like was a business move at the same time. So I'm curious if being adaptable is as vital as it seems like it is in your story.
Absolutely. As you do things, I think one big thing is just go in and do it and then learn as you go. And then as you learn, you obviously got to adapt because you got to learn new skills, got to go new places. Like with China, I like living in China. I didn't hate it, for the record. I just, 2 years, just small little nitpicks annoyed you. But yeah, I mean, just after living there for 2 years, just being in China, there was already like 100 sourcing companies, 100 sourcing agents that, I was competing against. So there's no, outside of like my connections with the outdoor industry and a few other personal connections, I didn't really have a leg up, a competitive advantage for these other sourcing companies. So like I moved to Vietnam and, at the time, a lot of whisper that or talk that Vietnam would be the next big country to kind of explode and grow. So I kind of just visiting Vietnam, loved it. I just kind of knew that there was nobody really sourcing from Vietnam. So for me, I was just looking for a competitive advantage. And, I visited on vacation for 2 weeks, just fell in love with the country, like great food, friendly people, great weather. I'm a warm weather guy, even though I live in Wisconsin. Yeah. So I was just, I was just like, I'd rather be here than there. I was willing to take that chance. And, I had to learn also the differences of Vietnam. Like it's not a quick start at all. Vietnam is culturally and the way businesses operate, the way factories like to work and whatnot is radically good. We're not radically different, but it's different from China. So you have to learn those nuances, those differences, those changes, and, adapt it. For instance, I had to adapt our business model a little bit too, to work with Vietnamese suppliers because they prefer to work directly with the end client. In China, you can negotiate and, we're a traditional sourcing agency where you took a commission, had people pay us. But then when we moved to Vietnam, the factories just did not like the business model. So we changed our business model so that the factories could connect directly with the clients. And that's kind of one thing we had to learn and adapt, for instance.
And I'm curious about some of those more things you learned. I also wanted to mention, I think that a lot of people don't totally understand these nuances that you're referring to. I mean,
yeah.
I saw something just the other day about how it's like a Swiss custom to have chit chat or some sort of small talk for the first 5 to 10 minutes of a business meeting before you get into business. I mean, and that's like totally customary. And if you don't do it, it's a massive faux pas. And so I just wanted to kind of mention that because, most business owners only think globally and maybe don't understand these intricate nuances, or they just work in a specific country. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And maybe what you learned from that experience navigating, like literally starting in Vietnam and navigating on from there.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, definitely. I guess we can start with China custom because China, they're all about relationship building when you talk to factories. So kind of, it's more than just chit chat. Like when I visit a factory in China, we'll usually go instead of a factory, go somewhere, eat lunch, spend an hour or two meeting with a team, talking. Business is never discussed really. You're just talking about personal life, things you enjoy. Eating and drinking, they also like to try and get you drunk for the meetings because I think they think you're more likely to make a deal drunk, to be honest. So I have to really restrict my drinking a lot of times. But yeah, and then you spend the 2 hours like talking with the team in that way. And then you go to the factory, and then that's kind of when you start seeing the factory and kind of talking business. Vietnam, yeah, it's a little bit more casual. Like when we do business meetings, like we go straight to the factory. A lot of the factories, some will have dedicated salespeople, but a lot of times they'll just have managers and engineers who do sales as a secondary thing. So they're a lot more direct. Like I'll make small talk like 5-10 minutes, fine. But then it's pretty quickly straight to business. And like when you're talking to an engineer, it's all numbers. So it's a lot more direct, a lot more straight to the point, which I don't know. Some people like, some people don't. I work with a lot of people that, done business in China for 10 years. And then they go to Vietnam and they're like, oh, these people don't want to do business with us. They just kind of push us in and out really quick. And we're like, no, that's actually just how they work. So, you just got to kind of adjust expectations there. Another thing too, like I mentioned kind of the business model, like we charge a flat rate and we do that for transparency in Vietnam. And we actually do that in China now too. There's a lot of distrust with kind of middlemen. The factories like to just make the product sell straight to the factory. So like we had to adjust that, kind of something we learned kind of talking to a lot of factories after a while. So we always let them know that they work for the end client. So it's just a lot of, just building trust. I think they're a little bit slower sometimes, but I mean, if you're want to do business, you got money. Money talks. So I mean, it's not hard to do business if you're a serious client. Obviously, it's just it's those small differences like that.
No, I think that's fascinating, especially, kind of what you took away from that. And I don't know, I really like the transparency piece. And there's a line between being honest and transparent and being like curt. And so other people can conflate one with the other sometimes. And that's cool that you were able to actually cater to that. I'm curious, outside from, the market share is kind of what I'm hearing you say. What makes Vietnam such a prime location for sourcing solutions? I mean, why Vietnam instead of Cambodia or something like that might not have, that you could still have market share?
Yeah, I mean, Vietnam is developing. It's kind of on the early steps. Like there's this, I don't know, there's like, I read a book a while ago about the Asian model of like developing countries in more or less 4 steps, and like Taiwan, Japan, Korea, they're the 4th step. China's probably a 3rd step, and Vietnam's at 2nd step, more or less. And it's just how they develop, how they kind of build industry, kind of focus on lower kind of quality goods, not lower quality, but lower cost goods to really kind of build up their industrial base. And so, I mean, 10 years ago, Vietnam was pre-trade war, really. Vietnam had a huge explosion post-trade war. Pre-trade war, Vietnam was definitely spending a lot of money to like build infrastructure, build factory, industrial parks. There's a lot of investment in factories. It was kind of really growing. And you could just see that there was really that ambition and kind of a government that was somewhat proactive, somewhat laissez-faire, and that they, in terms of regulation, is still a communist country. Yeah, I mean, there's just that growth there. I mean, it's also a bigger country. I mean, Vietnam has 93 million people, almost 100 million. Actually, I think it's 97 now. So almost 100 million. So it's a good base. It has a large young population. And so, I mean, there's just all the numbers and all the factors were there versus, Cambodia is just less developed in terms of like electricity, infrastructure, corruption, honestly. We dabbled. We have sourced in Cambodia, actually, just because a lot of Vietnamese factories have factories in Cambodia too. But I just honestly, with child labor and other workers' conditions, it's pretty bad in Cambodia. I don't trust it. We've dabbled in Thailand. We dabble in Malaysia. We dabble in Indonesia too. Those are all good. Taiwan as well. So we have sourced from those countries. But for us, just once you get down to it, Vietnam really offers a lot, pretty much everything that we kind of want, and just really kind of build a good base from there.
It checks multiple boxes.
Yeah, it checks multiple boxes. Like it's low labor costs, good enough infrastructure. It's borders China, which for a lot of things, like when we do backpacks, for instance, we'll get the zippers, we'll get the metal fasteners, the buckles, whatnot. Those will be actually made in China, shipped to Vietnam, and then they would be incorporated in design. We do furniture, the hinges, for instance, some metal parts. We'll source those from China. So, I mean, just being close to China too, you still have the whole total supply chain. It's pretty easy to actually, honestly, import stuff from China to Vietnam to be incorporated in a final product. But it does click a lot of boxes. Like the people in Vietnam are a lot more pretty technical, so we can do a lot more high-end fabric, like backpacks and stuff with technical fabrics, which is pretty good. It's a young workforce. I think the average age in Vietnam is like 23 or something, pretty low.
I'm curious if you could expand and contract at the same time, because I'm curious what specific things that you look at when you're vetting suppliers, sourcing solutions, some of these even more specific things. I mean, we talked about like the politics and child labor and cost and all that stuff, but maybe even when you're going to specific locations, what you look at this place versus this place, even though they could be in the same city even or the same country.
A lot of times, I mean, with the factories, age really kind of varies. So we do work a lot of older factories that are a little rusty, but they still make good products, especially metal goods. But when you vet a factory, I mean, you just got to look at what they make, what equipment they have on hand, and kind of the similar products. So, I mean, it really varies client by client. Like we're doing some metal tubing right now. I mean, that one's pretty industrial. So it's either they can or they can't make it because you've got specific wets of tubing. For instance, when we do bag factories, we have done tons of bag factories. So we have a pretty solid, reliable network. We know what factories are good or not, just from the quality they make. And you look at a lot of times, like if they have exported before, just because there's regulations in the United States about certain materials, certain aspects that you need to meet, like wooden goods, for instance. Like when we talk to a factory about wooden goods, you got to make sure that they don't use formaldehyde, for instance, because that's illegal. You can't import products that use formaldehyde in the United States, for instance. So you got to comply with LACIAC, which kind of documents the origin of the wood, make sure it's more or less ethically sourced, defumigated, all that. So, once you talk to factories, you more or less just kind of quiz them on those things. And then you can, tell by the answer if they're, you don't ask yes or no questions. You just ask kind of vague questions like, are you familiar? Like, tell me about your fumigation methods, for instance. And then you kind of vet them from there, check business licenses, stuff. Vietnam's good too, because they have a program called Vietnam Credit, which tests the credit worthiness. It's public information, for instance. So you can actually check their credit worthiness. It's more or less just a good or bad rating. But if they're in good standing, you can check their credit worthiness with a government database and see that, they have all their business licenses in place and they, are reputable, I guess.
That's pretty cool.
There's resources too.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a great resource.
Yeah, it's ran by the government too. So it's just a big central database for the whole country and every registered business. Basically make sure they're in good standing with the banks and business license, all that.
I'm curious about how you feel about, clearly you are hands-on, but now you live in Madison. When I look at the website, there's obviously a bunch of pictures of you at these factories on hand, talking to, people on the line, honestly. And I thought that was pretty cool. And now do you kind of miss that? You lived in China for a few years and you lived in Vietnam for a few years, but I imagine came back home, maybe, settled down, had a family. Do you kind of miss that hands-on aspect?
Hard too with the wife and kid and everything in the States now. But yeah, we have a team based in Ho Chi Minh City. So honestly, in terms of on the ground work, they do most of the work for us. We also have team in Shanghai. So yeah, in terms of on the ground work, they do all that for the most part. But I try to travel as much as I can. I was just there in May visiting Vietnam. Hoping to go back sooner than later. But yeah, before COVID, I was in Vietnam for 3 to 6 months a year and another 3 months-ish in China. Went to 3 months in China as well, just traveling and visiting factories and, working on projects. But yeah, COVID kind of disrupted that. And then during COVID, yeah, I had a kid and started a family.
Are you circling any other new prospect in terms of countries?
Yeah, yeah, we're constantly looking at expanding. I would say Thailand, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Indonesia are top targets. We've done a little bit with Sri Lanka just because there's one single huge garment manufacturer that makes everything from Lululemon to Victoria's Secret. But other than that, one giant factory that literally employs about 200,000 or 300,000, or multiple factories that employs 200,000, 300,000 people. There's not too much in Sri Lanka, but yeah, those were the main countries that we look at. And we've done projects in all those countries. I lived in Taiwan for 3 months, for instance, and Taiwan does a lot with higher end precision stuff, a lot of high end electronics. We were looking at doing some manufactured aircraft parts for aircraft lighting, actually, aftermarket aircraft lighting for like Boeing and Airbus jets, actually. So, that was high end precision stuff. And then recycled plastics. They actually have one of the best, they have the best recycling rate in the world. And from that, they actually make tons of fabrics and products from recycled plastic. So if you're environmental, so we actually do some dabble getting some fabrics imported from Taiwan, for instance, to Vietnam that use recycled bottles, for instance. Yeah, Thailand, Indonesia does. So Vietnam's largest shoe manufacturer. We've done some boots and some other wooden goods, industrial wooden goods in Indonesia. We've done bolts and some metal parts in Malaysia, and Thailand does a few random parts too.
One, I wanted to mention, I feel like that's becoming even more. I've talked to some people in logistics and sourcing who use entirely sustainable. They don't use any specific products, and it's way more costly, I got to tell you. But there is that environmental aspect that is a major selling point. So I'm curious if Cosmo Sourcing, one, I commend you for working with the recyclable materials. If there's any sort of, what would you consider Cosmo Sourcing's like pull? What's the that sort of pitch of why you instead of someone else?
I think just generally experience. Like we've been in Vietnam for almost 10 years now. We're definitely want to mix experience in Vietnam. Like our full transparency, like we actually disclose the full name, contact information, or free to work directly with the factories. I think it's a big one too. Yeah, like with our pricing, I know since we're not commission based, we work directly with the client. So we're beholden to advocate for the client instead our clients, our customers instead of the factory. So we're pretty flexible. We get multiple quotes from multiple factories, so you can get the best. You get multiple samples, so you can definitely weigh different factories against each other. And then, yeah, we have experience with sustainable products too and environmentally friendly products. Like we do a lot of wooden goods that are FSC certified, for instance. We do some clothing that are BSCI certified, SEDEX certified, Blue Sign. And so we can actually vet factories and get those in. And, just from experience, we know, ethical and sustainably sourced materials and whatnot.
I'm curious if there are any sort of common misconceptions about Vietnam or even just sourcing in Asia in general that you would like to dispel in general? Like, are there any misconceptions, honestly?
No, there are definitely. It's a good question. Yeah, I'm trying to think where to start though. I mean, just in general, I mean, I think it's pretty good place to source. With Vietnam, I mean, I think the big thing is a lot of people kind of go into Vietnam. They source private label products from China. Just go on Alibaba, get a product, slap a new logo on it, and then they expect that same thing from Vietnam, which is not really doable. Almost all the factories in Vietnam are contract manufacturers, so they expect clients to provide product spec sheets, provide design files of the product, and they'll make it to the specs, but they don't have like a few do, but not most don't have catalogs of products to just pick and put your name on. So I mean, a lot of people kind of expect that, and just it's not there. There's a few things like we're doing outdoor furniture right now, and there are a few factories that have catalogs and kind of existing designs, but for the most part, it's all going to be custom made products, contract manufacturing, custom made products. So just kind of expect to do a little bit of work, get design files made, get your product specs made, and then we'll work with the factory to get you that. So a lot of people don't.
That's wild. I mean, people just say, I need to sell pens, so make a pen for me.
I mean, you can do that in China. I mean, there's so many factories that just, they make their own designs, make their own products. There's off the shelf stuff. I mean, tons of, just go on Alibaba and just look around. I mean, there's literally thousands of factories in China do that, but Vietnam just doesn't do that.
No, and I think there's something commendable to that, where it's like a little bit of taking pride in your work, a little bit of originality, a little bit of like, we don't want to put out a product that isn't at the bare minimum to your standards. If I look online on Alibaba and say, I want this pen and I get it and I didn't like it, then I blame the factory. But if the factory got specs from me and then I get that product, then it's my fault, not the factory's,
Yeah, I mean, you got to really be hands-on to like enforce quality. I mean, that's one of the big values that we do in Vietnam is we're, team on the ground that enforces that. But yeah, it's going to be designed to your specs. So you got to specify, some quality standards. But I mean, there's advantages to that too. If you source, private label or white label products from China, you don't own those designs, and then 50 people can also buy from the same factory, same designs, unless you sign an exclusivity agreement. But when you take the effort to actually make your own design files, make your own, a product unique to yours. You own that design. That's an asset that you have that has value, and it allows you to have something unique. So, I mean, it is extra work. We do talk to a lot of people who don't want to put in that work, just kind of literally will get something off Alibaba from China, get hit with tariffs, think they can do it cheaper in China. And we're just, then they just give up because, they got to design files. They don't want to put that cost or effort in, but there's others that do. And those, a lot of these people succeed quite wildly, and they have a unique product that they have, design trademarks on and design brand trademarks, and they can protect the product on the market.
I'm curious if you had any advice for, anyone who's trying to get into sourcing. I mean, one, you're probably the second or third person I've talked to about it. And I noticed it's probably great for someone who likes to travel.
Yeah, I love traveling.
It's definitely a job for someone who likes to travel. But I'm curious if you had any advice, whether it's for entrepreneurs who are trying to work with someone like yourself to source their products for you, or if it's for someone who's interested in getting in the sourcing field, maybe advice that you wish you were given in 2012 when you were first starting out.
Yeah, mostly self-taught, to be honest. So yeah, I kind of like a few mentors that kind of helped me out, helped me get started, but they didn't do too much for me. But yeah, I mean, just in general, I think just build up your own connections and kind of, like I started out, like I said, specializing. So kind of pick out a niche and kind of work on that, just going and learn the market, learn the products and whatnot. But in general, I mean, it's a game. It's a business about connections ultimately. So, I mean, for us, like we have a team on the ground that's constantly meeting factories. I think just today we have 6 different factory visits scheduled from our various team members. We probably visit a dozen factories. I mean, you just got to constantly build connections, talk to factories, reach out to them. There's trade shows. So our team's going probably 2 or 3 trade shows a month. Yeah, I mean, just build those connections up. So, I mean, it's all about networking for this one. You're not going to really get by without knowing factories. And, I'm fortunate to have a team now. But I mean, when I was first starting, I was the one visiting the factories. I was traveling all throughout China, all throughout Vietnam to meet with these factories. So it's, just building a relationship with factories is kind of key. And then also your clients as well, the relationship with clients. And then kind of knowing products. Like each time we get a new product category, we're pretty good now, but, I had to like learn all about the fabric industry. For instance, when we started doing bags, just how, because there's like, if there's stretch, you got to have special things. There's some that you can heat weld instead of sew. That works better for that one. The different properties of materials, waterproofing, difference between nylons and polyesters and cottons and blends and all that. So you just kind of got to learn as you go too. Same with wood. Like we kind of when we did Vietnam, we kind of specialized in wooden goods, which have a lot of unique properties. Like there's a Lacey Act in the United States that I mentioned, just with how wood is imported, what quality and how to treat wood and work with wood and densities of wood and types of wood that have certain densities. Because when you're doing like the big industrial spools, they want it cheap. You can use the cheapest wood possible, just make these things because they were all cost conscious. But then we're doing wheelbarrow handles and shovel handles. And so, you got to have certain woods that have 700 or higher density. And then you got to know what that means, how to strength test them and all that, which woods you can and can't use. And I don't know, you just keep learning as you go along.
And I think there's something really fascinating about almost having to be a jack of all trades. A lot of people pick a lane and stay in it. They do textiles and they know everything. They are a total master of textiles. But in the path you've chosen, you have to be kind of a jack of all trades and a master of few at least, And
yeah, for me, I was just like, my lane's going to be Vietnam because that's kind of the specialty and focus on what Vietnam does. And then I learned what they do and the specifics of those things. Like shoes, I know way more than I should about soles and different foam densities and how to sew them up and down and the uppers and whatnot. And so, Vietnam is limited on what they can do, but what they can do, they have really good at it. So, there's like 5 or 6 different industries and we kind of started expanding one by one, more or less. Like silicone parts, there's been a lot of investment in silicone and injection molding manufacturing over the last few years. So I'm starting to learn more about plastics and silicone and stuff like that. And electronics for years, like electronics, just didn't have an industry. They were like big, like Canon, LG, Samsung, and all of them made their phones and TVs and stuff in Vietnam. But, they were only making more Samsung of those clients. But there's been growing electronic sector too. So now we're like learning a lot about electronics and OEM electronics. So we're starting to take on more electronic projects, which electronics is just like a whole nother beast. This kind of newest one that we're kind of learning because it just wasn't a thing in Vietnam. And we do rely a lot of time on our clients to be the experts and our factories to be the experts, and then us to just be the introducer, the person who connects them. But you still have to, understand the basics. So like we're doing some Bluetooth stuff to just help Bluetooth arrays work when we were bedding factories, we got to learn some stuff about that, for instance. But yeah, we do kind of rely a lot of times on our clients to be the experts, the ultimate experts, and just us to have a rudimentary understanding in which we can kind of vet factories. And then once we can, know enough to vet them and then do introductions, make sure they're good factories. Yeah. And then ultimately though, we're just doing an introduction, like for electronic parts. Once we kind of verified and vet them, we did an introduction to the factories and, they're doing their own verifications, but everything's looking good so far. Like they just for underwater stuff. So for underwater motor. So, they have waterproofing, but we were able to verify that they literally had a giant pool set up in the middle of factory to test the waterproofing of electronics, which is kind of
feels necessary.
Cool. Yeah, it was necessary.
I'm curious, looking at your experience, you've been in the industry for over a decade now. What are some of the big changes that you've seen in the last decade? More specifically, how these big changes might impact the future and what you would expect from what you've seen, what you expect to see in the future.
Yeah. China was already kind of developed when more or less when I was there, like in terms of like electronic sourcing and whatnot and connections and whatnot. But Vietnam just in general has exploded a ton since I've been there. Yeah, when I first started out in Vietnam, it was very underdeveloped. It was very simple items, very basic, focused on cheapness. But just throughout the decade, really, they've invested a ton in better manufacturing techniques, higher quality, like more machinery, more robotics, more electronic ways to monitor progress electronically and quality controls like that. And that's all been done within really the last 5-ish years. So, it's definitely outside of China. There's countries that already like Japan and whatnot already have developed industrial sector, but just Vietnam, and other countries, they're investing a ton and it's growing and advancing so much more in terms of what they can't do. And I think too, it's just, getting everything online and just monitoring stuff. Because before, it's just basic, simple photos, but now you can have live monitoring of progress and whatnot, which is pretty cool.
No, absolutely. Before we wrap up, Jim, I always ask the guest the same last question. In the e-commerce space and the entrepreneurial space, it can be very stress-inducing more than some other industries. And I'm curious, you're a pretty Zen guy, I'll tell you though, and I think that might be the outdoorsiness.
I think you just got to figure out that problems can be solved and they can't be solved, and
yeah. And I'm curious, how you might solve some of the mental health problems or whatever. I find that hobbies and interests are kind of intrinsically tied to that work-life harmony, So I'm curious what some of your hobbies and interests are that you do to stay zen.
Yeah, in terms of like hobbies and whatnot, like I'm on a curling league here in Wisconsin. I do a lot of hiking, a lot of exploring. Injured my foot, but I was a big runner and biker before that. As recently, just a few months ago. So I'll probably be back on the mend soon. Yeah, so I mean, I try to be active and try to be outdoorsy and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, just in general, I just kind of separate your personal life and your work life. I think is kind of the key. And I mean, obviously jump in and go outside of your comfort zone, but there is times where you can bite off too much you can chew. And I mean, that's a lot of times where the stress is. And so for me, it was just kind of slowly building the company piece by piece and figuring out where to go. So like when I was doing Hartford Outdoor Sports Supply, I was super stressful because we did have inventory, a lot of call stuff front, money that I barely had. So that was super stressful. But I mean, one of the reasons I feel like I transitioned to a service company is there wasn't that stress of inventory. I mean, I won't say, but I kind of pass that stress on the clients and have them do that. But it's, with service company, it's, your time, that's the asset. So it's and your expertise. So kind of one of the reasons I kind of feel like I transitioned from a product company to a service company is because of that. I just hated like inventory management. I hated dealing with the buying of large products. I hated like getting loans and all that. So it's just kind of transition from that and kind of focusing on what you know. But I mean, there was tons of stress for years and years. But I mean, once you're established, you kind of get your routines, your team in place and whatnot. It definitely takes a lot of stress off having a good team.
Absolutely. It definitely takes a village. Jim, I really want to appreciate you for your time. I hope your foot heals up and good luck with Cosmo Sourcing, man.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I'd like to thank my guest, Jim Kennemer, for joining me on the show. And come back next time when I talk with Justin Sardi, the CEO and co-founder of TubeSift, a YouTube ads targeting tool that empowers users to set up high-performing video ad campaigns quickly by taking the manual work out of finding precision-targeted, monetized placements for YouTube advertising campaigns. For more information about Jim, you can connect with him on LinkedIn. To learn more about Cosmo Sourcing, visit their website, cosmosourcing.com, or follow them on Facebook and Instagram at Cosmo Sourcing. And that's our show. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you come back to find more insight from the top experts in the e-commerce community. Until then.